We think of the Second World War in simple terms. Good versus evil, heroes and villains, but reality was never that clean. The lines were blurry. Nations and people made choices we rarely hear about. Alliances were formed in shadows. Deals were struck for survival, for profit, or for a future that never came to be. Did you know that a future leader of India sought help from the German government? Or that an American car company was building trucks for both sides? The story we are told is just one version. It is the official story, the accepted one, but beneath it, there are countless other stories. Stories of collaboration between sworn enemies. Stories of neutral countries that were not so neutral. Stories of money crossing battle lines as if they were not there. These are the uncomfortable truths. They challenge what we think we know about the most destructive conflict in human history. What happens when you look at the war not as a grand battle of ideologies, but as a complex web of human interests? What do these forgotten alliances tell us about the nature of power, survival, and loyalty? Number 22 was Sweden really neutral? Everyone knows Sweden was neutral during the war, a haven of peace in a continent on fire. But that neutrality was a complicated, pragmatic thing. It was not passive, it was an active strategy for survival, and it involved deep collaboration with the German government. The key was iron ore. The German war industry ran on steel. To make steel, you need high-grade iron ore. Sweden had some of the best in the world, mined in the far north, in places like Kiruna and Gällivare. From 1939 to late 1944, Sweden was the single most important supplier of this critical resource to the German Reich. We are not talking about small amounts, we are talking about over 10 million tons a year. That ore was loaded onto trains and ships, crossing the Baltic, or going through the Norwegian port of Narvik, directly into the furnaces of German industry. Without that constant flow of Swedish iron, the production of tanks, ships, and weapons would have been severely hampered. Some historians, like John Gilmore, author of Sweden, the Swastika, and the Star of David, argue that this trade may have prolonged the conflict. The Swedish government, led by Prime Minister Per Albin Hansson, walked a tightrope. They called it a policy of pragmatism. On one hand, they feared an invasion. They saw what happened in Norway and Denmark. On the other, they were a trading nation. The German economy was their biggest partner, so they made a deal. They would keep selling the ore, but it was not just about ore. Sweden also allowed the German military to use its state-owned railway system. This was called the permanent traffic, or the transit traffic. Between 1940 and 1943, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, medical staff, and tons of equipment were transported across neutral Swedish territory. They traveled from Norway to Finland and back again. This was a direct violation of the principles of neutrality, which state that a neutral country cannot allow belligerent forces to use its territory. The Swedish government justified it as a necessary concession to avoid a worse fate. There were also deep financial ties. Swedish banks, particularly the Enskilda Bank, run by the influential Wallenberg family, maintained business relationships with German companies and financial institutions throughout the war. They handled transactions, credits, and other financial instruments that helped keep the German economy functioning. Jacob Wallenberg, a key figure, met with senior German officials multiple times. His actions and those of his bank have been debated for decades. Were they collaborators, or were they pragmatists using their connections to also help people and gather intelligence for the Allies? The truth is likely a mix of both. Sweden's story shows that neutrality was not a simple declaration of non-involvement. It was an active, difficult, and morally complex series of choices made day by day. They maintained their sovereignty. They avoided occupation, but they did so by fueling the war machine of one side. What private communications passed between the Swedish King Gustav V and the German leadership that we have not yet seen? Were there verbal agreements or understandings that were never written down, which explained the full extent of their cooperation? How much did the average Swedish citizen know about the troop transports crossing their country at night? Number 21. Did Swiss banks have a side? Switzerland, like Sweden, is the classic example of a neutral country, a mountainous fortress of peace and stability. But its neutrality was also built on a foundation of economic collaboration, especially through its powerful and secretive banking system. The Swiss did not just stay out of the war, they profited from it. They became the bankers for everyone, including, most significantly, the German Reich. During the conflict, the Swiss National Bank bought massive amounts of gold from the German Reichsbank. The problem was where that gold came from. A significant portion of it was looted. It was taken from the central banks of occupied countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Austria. Some of it was monetary gold, but other portions included assets seized from individuals and victims of persecution. A major study after the war, known as the Bergier Commission Report, was established by the Swiss government in the 1990s to investigate these dealings. The report, published in 2002, was damning. It concluded that the Swiss National Bank knew, or at least should have known, that it was dealing in stolen assets. By accepting this gold, Swiss banks gave the German government something it desperately needed: hard currency. Specifically, Swiss francs. Why were Swiss francs so important? The German war economy needed to buy critical raw materials from other neutral countries like Portugal, Spain, and Turkey. These countries would not accept German currency. They wanted a stable, convertible currency. The Swiss franc was the gold standard. So the German government would sell looted gold to Switzerland, receive francs in return, and then use those francs to buy tungsten from Portugal for armor-piercing shells or chrome from Turkey for steel production. The Swiss banking system was the essential middleman that converted stolen assets into usable war materials. Beyond gold, Swiss industry was also deeply integrated with the German war effort. Companies like Oerlikon sold anti-aircraft cannons. Swiss watchmakers sold precision timers and fuses for munitions. The Swiss railway system was also a vital transit route for goods, including coal, steel, and other materials, between Germany and its ally, Italy. These were not secret operations. They were open, state-sanctioned economic policies. The Swiss government, under figures like President Philipp Eder, argued that this was intellectual neutrality. They claimed they could trade with one side without ideologically supporting them. It was, like in Sweden, a strategy for survival. Switzerland was completely surrounded by Axis powers. Refusing to trade would have likely led to an invasion. The collaboration went further. Swiss insurance companies had policies on German assets. Swiss companies owned subsidiaries inside Germany that produced for the war effort. The connections were a dense web of finance, industry, and logistics. This economic entanglement meant that Switzerland had a vested interest in the German economy not collapsing. The Bergier Commission found that these economic relationships contributed to the prolongation of the war. This story complicates the image of Switzerland as a simple bystander. It was an active economic partner. Its neutrality was not just a political stance, it was a business model. A model that protected the country, but also made it complicit in the economic machinery of the conflict. What records from private Swiss banks remained sealed or were destroyed, which could reveal the full extent of their dealings with private German industrialists. How many officials in the Swiss National Bank privately objected to the gold transactions, but were overruled? And what would have happened if Switzerland had refused to be the financial clearinghouse for the German regime? Number 20, why did an American car company build for the German army? The story of Ford Motor Company and its German subsidiary, Ford Worke, is one of the most unsettling examples of corporate collaboration across enemy lines. Before the war, major American corporations had invested heavily in Germany. When the conflict began, these relationships did not simply vanish. They became incredibly complicated. Ford had a long history in Germany, opening its first plant in 1925. By the late 1930s, Ford Worke was a significant player in the German automotive industry. When the new government came to power in 1933, Henry Ford himself was admired by some of its leaders for his pioneering work in mass production. He was even awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle in 1938, the highest honor the regime could bestow on a foreigner. As Germany rearmed, Ford Worke, like all German industry, was pulled into the effort. The company began producing trucks and other vehicles for the German military. When the war in Europe began in 1939, Ford Worke was a key supplier. The strange part is that the company was still 100% owned by the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan. This meant that an American parent company owned a factory that was building military equipment for a power that would soon be at war with the United States. The situation became even more complex after the United States entered the war in December 1941. At that point, the U.S. government took over day-to-day control of Ford Workey appointing a custodian to run the plant. However, the ownership structure remained. Ford in the U.S. still technically owned the factory. Throughout the war, Ford Workey continued its production. It built thousands of military trucks, half-tracks, and engines for the German army. These were the very vehicles used to transport troops and supplies on the eastern and western fronts. The historian Neil Baldwin, in his book Henry Ford and the Jews, documented the deep and often troubling connections between Ford and the German regime. To make matters worse, Ford Work, like many German companies at the time, used forced labor. Workers from occupied countries were brought to the Cologne plant to keep production going. After the war, this led to legal claims and a great deal of controversy. Ford was not alone. General Motors had a similar situation with its German subsidiary, Opel. Opel was a leading producer of vehicles for the German military, including the famous Blitz truck, which was a workhorse of the German army. Like Ford, GM in the U.S. technically lost direct control of its subsidiary during the war, but the fact remains that American-built factories with American technology and production methods were a critical part of the German war machine. After the war, Ford even sought and received compensation from the U.S. government for damages to its Ford Work plants from Allied bombing. It was a bizarre conclusion, an American company being compensated for damage to its German factory that had been building trucks for the enemy. The story reveals a troubling aspect of global capitalism. For some corporations, the lines on a map and the flags of nations were less important than the bottom line. Business, it seemed, could transcend even a world war. How much direct communication occurred between Ford executives in the U.S. and the managers of Ford Work after 1941 through neutral channels like Switzerland? Did Henry Ford personally approve any of the pre-war military contracts for the German subsidiary? And to what extent did the production methods pioneered in Detroit give the German military a logistical advantage it otherwise would not have had? Number 19, could Finland be an ally of both sides? And Finland's position during the Second World War is unique and often misunderstood. They fought two separate wars, the Winter War 1939 to 1940 against the Soviet Union, and then the Continuation War 1941 to 1944, where they fought alongside German forces also against the Soviet Union. This has led some to label Finland as an Axis power, but the Finns never saw it that way. They called it co-belligerence, and they claimed they were not allies of Germany, but simply a nation fighting a common enemy for their own reasons. The story begins with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, the non-aggression treaty between Germany and the Soviet Union. In a secret part of that deal, Finland was assigned to the Soviet sphere of influence. A few months later, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, starting the Winter War. The small Finnish army put up a remarkable resistance, but was eventually forced to cede territory. This experience left a deep scar and a profound fear of their eastern neighbor. So, when the German government began planning its invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, they found a willing partner in Finland. The Finnish government, led by President Risto Ryti and the military commander Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, saw it as a chance to reclaim the territory they had lost. German troops were allowed to stage in northern Finland. The Finnish army coordinated its offensive with the German army. For 3 years they fought side by side on the northern part of the Eastern Front, but Finland maintained a degree of independence that other German partners did not. They never signed the Tripartite Pact, the formal military alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan. They ran their own section of the front and refused to take orders directly from the German High Command. For example, the Finnish army advanced to the old 1939 border and then largely stopped. Mannerheim refused German requests to launch a full-scale attack on Leningrad from the north, a move that might have sealed the city's fate. He also resisted pressure to hand over Finnish Jewish citizens to the German authorities. Finland was in a strange diplomatic position. It was a functioning democracy with a free press and elections that was fighting alongside a totalitarian regime. It was also technically at war with the United Kingdom, which had declared war in 1941 due to Finland's partnership with Germany. Yet, the United States never declared war on Finland. Diplomatic relations were broken, but a formal state of war never existed. The U.S. saw Finland's fight as a separate conflict aimed at the Soviet Union, not the Western Allies. In 1944, as the tide of the war turned, Finland sought a separate peace, they signed an armistice with the Soviet Union in September. One of the conditions of the armistice was that Finland had to expel all German troops from its territory. This led to the final, bizarre chapter of Finland's war, the Lapland War, 1944 to 1945. The Finnish army turned and fought its former co-belligerents, the Germans, driving them out of northern Finland. In the space of 5 years, Finland had fought the Soviets, then fought with the Germans against the Soviets, and then fought the Germans. And Finland's story is a masterclass in political and military pragmatism. It was not about ideology, it was about national survival. Mannerheim and the Finnish leadership made a series of difficult choices to navigate the pressures from two powerful, aggressive neighbors. Their co-belligerence was a strategy to preserve Finland's independence, and against all odds it worked. What level of secret diplomatic contact was maintained between Finland and the United States between 1941 and 1944? Were there any informal agreements that ensured the U.S. would not declare war? Did Marshal Mannerheim have a red line plan to turn against his German partners even before 1944 if their demands became too extreme? And how did the average Finnish soldier reconcile fighting alongside the German army while their country remained a democracy? Number 18, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem working with? Haj Amin al-Husseini was a major figure in the Arab world during the 1920s and 30s. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, a powerful religious and political leader of the Palestinian Arabs under the British Mandate. He was also a fervent nationalist who opposed both British rule and the Zionist movement. His search for a powerful ally to help his cause led him to a controversial and damaging collaboration with the Axis powers, particularly the German government. His opposition to the British authorities forced him to flee Palestine in 1937. He spent time in Lebanon and Iraq, where he helped instigate a pro-German coup in 1941. When that coup failed, he fled to Europe. He found refuge in Italy and then Germany. In Berlin, he was welcomed as a valuable propaganda tool. He met with the German Chancellor and other senior officials in November 1941. He was given a villa, a generous salary, and access to radio broadcasting facilities. From Berlin, al-Husseini became a leading voice of Arab-language propaganda for the German regime. He broadcasted regularly to the Middle East, calling on Arabs to rise up against the British and to support the Axis cause. He framed the war as an opportunity for Arab liberation. He argued that a German victory would mean the end of British and French colonialism and a halt to Jewish immigration to Palestine. His message was a mix of anti-imperialism, nationalism, and religious rhetoric. His collaboration went beyond propaganda. He was actively involved in recruiting Muslims from the Balkans, particularly from Bosnia, for special units of the German armed forces. These units, like the 13th Waffen Mountain Division, were formed partly for military purposes and partly for propaganda, to show that Muslims supported the German cause. Al-Husseini would visit the troops, give speeches, and provide spiritual guidance. He was trying to build a bridge between his vision of Arab nationalism and the strategic goals of the German government. The core of his belief was simple. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. For al-Husseini, the primary enemy was the British Empire and the Zionist movement. The German government was the most powerful force in the world that also opposed the British. Therefore, an alliance was logical. He believed that a German victory would allow him to return to Palestine and establish an independent Arab state. However, his influence was more limited than he or the Germans hoped. While his broadcasts were heard across the Middle East, they did not spark the mass uprisings he called for. Many Arab nationalists were suspicious of the Axis powers, seeing them as just another set of European imperialists. The collaboration is detailed in books like The Mufti of Jerusalem by Klaus Gensicke. It shows a man so focused on his primary goals that he was willing to align himself with a deeply problematic regime. After the war, al-Husseini was captured. He was sought by Yugoslavia for his role in recruiting in the Balkans. However, he managed to escape to Egypt. His wartime collaboration permanently tainted his reputation and weakened the Palestinian nationalist movement in the eyes of the West. it became a piece of history that was difficult to confront, a story of how the quest for national liberation could lead to a dark and compromising alliance. What was the full extent of the financial support provided to al-Husseini by the German government, and how was that money distributed to his network in the Middle East? Were there any specific intelligence sharing operations between his agents and German intelligence in the region? And how much did the German leadership genuinely care about the cause of Arab independence versus simply using him as a convenient tool for their own strategic aims? Number 17, why did Indian soldiers fight for the other side? The story of Subhas Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army INA is one of the most complex and contested chapters of the war. Bose was a prominent leader in the Indian independence movement, a contemporary and sometimes rival of Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. But while they advocated nonviolent resistance against British rule, Bose was a pragmatist who believed that freedom could be won by any means necessary. This belief led him to seek alliances with the enemies of the British Empire. Bose was arrested by the British at the start of the war. He escaped from house arrest in India in 1941 and made a perilous journey to Afghanistan, then to the Soviet Union, and finally to Germany. In Berlin, he met with German leaders, like the Grand Mufti. He was seen as a useful asset. He established a Free India Center and began radio broadcasts to India, urging his countrymen to rise up against the British. His most ambitious project in Germany was the creation of the Indian Legion, or the Indische Legion. It was a military unit composed of Indian prisoners of war who had been captured by the German and Italian armies in North Africa. Bose visited the POW camps and delivered powerful speeches. He offered them a choice: remain in the camps or join a new army to fight for India's freedom. Several thousand soldiers agreed. They were trained and equipped by the German army. However, the Indian Legion never saw significant combat on behalf of Germany. They were mostly used for coastal defense in France. Their value was primarily symbolic, but Bose grew frustrated with the German government. He felt they were not truly committed to the cause of Indian independence. Their strategic focus was on Europe, not Asia. So in 1943, Bose undertook another incredible journey. He traveled by German and then Japanese submarine from Germany all the way to Japanese-controlled Southeast Asia. In Singapore, he took command of a movement that had already begun, the Indian National Army. The INA was initially formed by Japan in 1942, also using Indian POWs captured after the fall of Singapore. Under Bose's charismatic leadership, the INA was revitalized. It grew to tens of thousands of soldiers. Bose established a provisional government of Free India, which was recognized by the Axis powers. The INA, fighting alongside the Japanese army, took part in the 1944 invasion of India. Their goal was to march on Delhi. They crossed the border into India and raised the Indian flag on Indian soil in the state of Manipur. For a moment, it seemed like their audacious plan might work, but the offensive, known as the Battle of Imphal and Kohima, was a disaster. The Japanese and INA forces were defeated by the British and Indian Army. They were pushed back by a combination of logistical failures, monsoon rains, and fierce resistance. Bose died in a plane crash in 1945, shortly after Japan's surrender. The surviving soldiers of the INA were captured and put on trial by the British for treason. But the trials backfired. The Indian public saw the INA soldiers not as traitors, but as patriots who had fought for their country's freedom, even if they had chosen the wrong allies. The INA trials became a major catalyst for the end of British rule, which came just 2 years later. Bose's legacy is deeply controversial. Was he a hero and a revolutionary, or a misguided collaborator? The answer depends on who you ask. His story highlights the painful choices faced by anti-colonial movements during the war. For Bose, the enemy was British imperialism, and he was willing to ally with anyone, no matter their ideology, to defeat it. What promises were made to Bose in private by the German and Japanese leadership regarding the future of an independent India? How much operational control did the Japanese military have over the INA during the Imphal campaign? And what would have happened if the INA and the Japanese had actually succeeded in capturing a major Indian city? Number 16, could you be neutral while cooperating with a belligerent? The case of Spain under General Francisco Franco is a fascinating study in the art of non-belligerence. After winning the Spanish Civil War in 1939 with significant help from Germany and Italy, many expected Spain to formally join the Axis powers when the wider war began. It never did. Instead, Franco walked a careful line, offering substantial support to the Axis cause while officially staying out of the conflict. The most famous example of this was the Blue Division, or the Division Azul. In 1941, after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Franco's government authorized the formation of a volunteer division to fight on the Eastern Front. This was a clever political move. It allowed Franco to repay his debt to the German government and show his ideological alignment against communism without formally declaring war on the Western Allies. The division was composed of over 18,000 Spanish volunteers, mostly members of the Falange Party and veterans of the Civil War. The Blue Division was integrated into the German army. They were issued German uniforms with a Espana shield on the sleeve. They fought for nearly 2 years on the brutal Eastern Front, primarily around Leningrad. They earned a reputation for being tough and resilient fighters, but they also suffered immense casualties. In total, nearly 50,000 Spaniards served in the division over its existence. But Spain's collaboration was not just military. Economically, Spain was a vital partner for the German war effort. It was a major source of tungsten, a critical mineral used to harden steel for armor plate and armor-piercing projectiles. The Spanish ports were also used by German submarines and ships for refueling and repairs, a clear violation of neutrality. And Spanish intelligence services collaborated closely with their German counterparts. The historian Stanley G. Payne, in his work on the Franco regime, has detailed the extensive nature of this cooperation. So why did Spain never formally join the war? Franco was a shrewd pragmatist. He knew his country was devastated after the Civil War. The military was weak, and the economy was in ruins. A full-scale war would have been a disaster for Spain. He also kept making demands that the German government was unwilling to meet. He wanted control of French Morocco and other territories in North Africa, which would have created a conflict with Vichy France, another German partner. As the war turned against the Axis after 1943, Franco began to pivot. He withdrew the Blue Division from the Eastern Front. He started to limit the access of German ships to his ports. He began to sell more tungsten to the Allies. He was repositioning Spain to survive in a post-war world that would be dominated by the Allies. His strategy worked. His regime, though internationally isolated for a time, survived until his death in 1975. Spain's story shows a different kind of collaboration. It was not a full alliance, but a calculated partnership of convenience. Franco gave the German government enough support to keep them happy, but never enough to drag his own country into a devastating war. It was a high-stakes balancing act that defined his long rule. What was the true nature of the secret talks between Franco and the German Chancellor at their famous meeting in Hendaye, France, in 1940? Were there secret clauses or verbal agreements that shaped Spain's policy for the rest of the war? How much did Allied intelligence know about the extent of German submarine activity in Spanish ports? And did the existence of the Blue Division prevent a potential German invasion of Spain? Number 15 was the Vatican truly impartial. The role of the Vatican and Pope Pius XII during the Second World War is one of the most debated and sensitive subjects of the era. The Holy See was officially a neutral state. Its stated goal was to remain impartial, to work for peace, and to alleviate human suffering on all sides. But its silence on many issues and its complex diplomatic maneuvering have led to decades of criticism and defense. The Vatican's primary policy was one of diplomacy behind closed doors. Pope Pius XIV had been the papal nuncio ambassador to Germany before becoming pope, so he had a deep understanding of the country and its politics. He believed that public denunciations of the German regime and its actions would be counterproductive. He feared it would lead to greater persecution of Catholics in German-occupied territories and would achieve nothing positive. This view is often defended in works like The Myth of Hitler's Pope by Rabbi David G. Dahlin, who argues the Pope did what he could in secret. Instead of public condemnations, the Vatican used its diplomatic channels and network of churches, convents, and monasteries to provide aid and shelter. Thousands of people, including many Jews, were hidden in Vatican City itself and in other church properties throughout Italy. The Vatican's radio service broadcasted information about missing persons. Its diplomats in places like Turkey and Hungary worked to provide fake baptismal certificates and other documents to help people escape persecution. However, the Vatican's official neutrality also meant it engaged in formal diplomatic relations with the German government. The Vatican had signed a concordat, or treaty, with the German government in 1933, which was meant to protect the rights of the Catholic Church. Throughout the war, the Pope received German diplomats and maintained communication with Berlin. This led to accusations that the Vatican was lending legitimacy to a criminal regime. The most pointed criticism revolves around the Pope's public silence. He never explicitly and publicly condemned the German government's systematic persecution of minorities. When German forces occupied Rome in 1943, and over 1,000 Roman Jews were rounded up literally in the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica, the Pope made only a vague, indirect protest. Critics like John Cornwell in his controversial book Hitler's Pope argue that this silence was a moral failure. They believe the Pope had a duty to speak out, regardless of the consequences. The Vatican's defenders argue that this is hindsight. At the time, they say the Pope and his advisors believed that quiet, practical action was more effective than loud but empty protests. They point to an incident in the Netherlands where a public condemnation by Dutch bishops of the persecution of Jews was immediately followed by a wave of arrests of Jewish converts to Catholicism. This, they argue, proved that speaking out made things worse. The story is a tangle of moral ambiguity. The Vatican was not a collaborator in the sense of actively helping the German war effort, but its policy of cautious diplomacy and public silence, while arguably saving some lives, has left it open to the charge that it failed to use its immense moral authority to confront evil directly. The debate continues today, with the Vatican slowly opening its wartime archives to scholars. What specific information did the Pope receive from his bishops and diplomats across Europe about the nature and scale of the atrocities being committed? Did the Pope ever draft a strong public condemnation of the German regime that he ultimately decided not to release? And how much did the Vatican's fear of communism and the Soviet Union influence its calculations regarding the German government, which it saw as a bulwark against Soviet expansion? Number 14, how did Argentina become a safe haven? During the Second World War, much of Latin America eventually sided with the Allies, at least formally. But Argentina was a major exception. It remained officially neutral until the final weeks of the war in March 1945. And this neutrality was heavily tilted in favor of the Axis powers. This was due to a combination of economic ties, cultural affinity, and the political leanings of its military government. The Argentinian military leadership, which came to power in a coup in 1943, was deeply influenced by European military traditions, particularly the German one. Figures like Juan Perón, who was then a rising colonel and would later become president, were openly sympathetic to the Axis cause. They admired the discipline and nationalism of the regimes in Germany and Italy. There was also a large and influential German community in Argentina, which provided a strong base of support for the German government. Economically, Argentina had strong trade links with Germany before the war. While the British naval blockade made direct trade difficult, the sympathy remained. More importantly, Argentine companies and individuals acted as a front for German businesses, helping them to continue operating and to protect their assets from being seized by the Allies. Argentine banks were used to move money. This pro-Axis neutrality made the country a hub of espionage for both sides. German agents operated with a great deal of freedom in Buenos Aires, gathering intelligence on Allied shipping and political developments. The most controversial aspect of Argentina's role came after the war. As the German government collapsed in 1945, many former officials and individuals implicated in war crimes sought to escape. Argentina, under the leadership of Juan Perón, became one of the primary destinations. A network of escape routes, often called rat lines, was established. These were operated by a mix of people, including sympathetic officials within the Argentine government, members of the Catholic clergy, and intelligence agents. Through these rat lines, hundreds, possibly thousands, of former officials from the German government and other collaborationist regimes in Europe found a safe haven in Argentina. They were provided with false identities and travel documents. Once in Argentina, they were able to live in relative obscurity, protected by a government that was not interested in looking too closely at their pasts. This story is painstakingly documented in Ukigoni's book, The Real Odessa, which used newly declassified Argentine archives to trace the inner workings of these escape networks. The Allied powers were aware of this and put immense pressure on Argentina to change its stance. There was an economic blockade and diplomatic isolation. This is what eventually forced Argentina to declare war in 1945, when the outcome was no longer in doubt. But by then, the groundwork had been laid for the country to become a post-war refuge. Argentina's collaboration was not about sending troops or supplying weapons. It was about providing political, economic, and moral support. It was about creating a friendly space on the other side of the world, a place where the interests of the German regime were protected during the war, and where its personnel could find safety after it ended. What was the exact role of Juan Perón in organizing and approving the post-war rat lines? How much money from the German government was transferred to Argentine banks in the final months of the war, and what happened to it? And were there any secret agreements between Argentine and German intelligence services that promised safe passage for certain individuals in the event of a German defeat? Number 13. What deal was struck before the war even began? One of the most cynical and shocking alliances of the period was not made during the war, but immediately before it. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939 between the German government and the Soviet Union, is often remembered as a simple non-aggression treaty. But it was much more than that. It was a full-blown collaboration that gave both regimes a green light for territorial expansion. The public part of the pact was straightforward. The two countries promised not to attack each other. This was a stunning development, as the two regimes had spent years denouncing each other as their primary ideological enemies. The deal shocked the world. But the real substance of the pact was hidden in a secret protocol. This secret protocol was a blunt agreement to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland was to be partitioned between them. The Soviet Union was given a free hand in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and a part of Romania-Bessarabia. And Germany was given Lithuania, which was later traded for parts of Poland. It was a cold-blooded plan drawn up by two dictators, Joseph Stalin and the German Chancellor, to carve up their neighbors. Just 1 week after the pact was signed, Germany invaded Poland from the west. 2 weeks after that, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. The country was crushed between the two powers, as they had planned. The collaboration was immediate and practical. The Soviet Union also moved to occupy the Baltic states and attack Finland, just as the secret protocol had allowed. But the collaboration was also economic. The two countries signed a comprehensive trade agreement. The Soviet Union, rich in natural resources, supplied Germany with huge quantities of oil, grain, rubber, and manganese. These were all materials that were vital for the German war machine and helped it to bypass the British naval blockade. In return, Germany provided the Soviet Union with manufactured goods, technology, and military hardware, including cruisers, naval guns, and aircraft designs. For nearly 2 years, from late 1939 to June 1941, the Soviet Union was a key economic partner of the German government, fueling its war against France and Britain. There was even military cooperation. The German Navy was allowed to use a base near Murmansk in the Soviet Arctic for a time. The two intelligence services shared information. This period of cooperation is often downplayed or forgotten, especially in Russia, because it complicates the later narrative of the Great Patriotic Struggle. But as detailed by historians like Richard Overy, it was a crucial phase of the war. This alliance of convenience ended abruptly in June 1941 when the German government broke the pact and launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The collaboration turned into the largest and most brutal conflict in human history, but the 22 months of the pact had been enormously consequential. It had allowed the German government to secure its eastern flank and conquer Western Europe without fear of a two-front war. It had allowed the Soviet Union to expand its own territory significantly. It was a partnership based on pure cynical self-interest, and it set the stage for the global catastrophe that followed. What was the full extent of the technology transfer from Germany to the Soviet Union during the pact? Did Soviet engineers get access to advanced German military projects? How much did Stalin and his inner circle truly believe the pact would last, versus seeing it as a temporary measure to buy time? And are there still undiscovered codicils or verbal understandings from the Moscow meetings that would shed more light on the long-term plans of both regimes? Number 12, how did a Chinese warlord collaborate with the invaders? The war in China was a long and brutal affair, beginning well before the conflict in Europe. It is often portrayed as a straightforward struggle between the Japanese invaders and a united Chinese resistance. But The reality on the ground was far more fragmented. China was a patchwork of territories controlled by the nationalist government, the Kuomintang or KMT, the communists, and various independent warlords. Some of these warlords chose a third path collaboration. One of the most significant examples was the reorganized National Government of China, established in 1940. It is often called the Wang Jingwei regime, after its leader. Wang Jingwei had been a major figure in the KMT and a rival of its leader Chiang Kai-shek. But while Chiang retreated into the interior to continue the resistance, Wang came to believe that fighting Japan was a lost cause. He argued that continued war would only destroy China. He advocated for a policy of peace and collaboration. In 1940, he defected from the KMT and, with Japanese support, established a new government in Nanjing, the former nationalist capital. This government claimed to be the legitimate government of China. It was a puppet state, completely controlled by the Japanese military. Japan recognized it and transferred nominal control of some occupied territories to it. The regime had its own flag, its own army, and its own bureaucracy. The army of the Wang Jingwei regime, often called the Collaborationist Chinese Army, was substantial. Grew to include several 100,000 soldiers. These were mostly former KMT troops who had surrendered or warlord armies who saw collaboration as a better option than resistance. This army did not typically fight major battles against the KMT or the communists. Its primary role was pacification. They were used by the Japanese to guard supply lines, police occupied cities, and fight against guerrilla forces. In effect, the Japanese were using Chinese soldiers to control other Chinese people, freeing up Japanese troops for campaigns elsewhere. The collaboration was also economic. The Nanjing regime helped the Japanese exploit the resources of occupied China. They facilitated the collection of taxes, the procurement of food for the Japanese army, and the mobilization of labor for Japanese projects. Wang and his followers justified their actions by claiming they were protecting the Chinese people from the worst excesses of direct Japanese military rule. But they argued that by having a Chinese government in place, even a puppet one, they could soften the blows of occupation. This idea is sometimes called curve-saving nationalism, the idea that you collaborate to save the nation from complete destruction. This created a complex and tragic situation. The war in China was not just a two-sided conflict. It was a three-way, and sometimes four-way, struggle. The Japanese fought the KMT and the communists, but the KMT and the communists also fought each other. And all three fought against the collaborationist forces of the Wang Jingwei regime. It was a civil war wrapped inside a war of resistance. Wang Jingwei died in 1944. After Japan's surrender in 1945, his regime collapsed. Its leaders were arrested and tried for treason by the victorious nationalists. The legacy of collaboration remains a deeply painful and controversial topic in China today. It is a story of political rivalry, desperation, and the impossible choices people make in the face of overwhelming military force. How much popular support did the Wang Jingwei regime actually have among the Chinese population in the occupied zones? Were people just compliant out of fear, or did some genuinely believe in his message of peace? What was the nature of the secret communications between members of the collaborationist government and Chiang Kai-shek's government in Chongqing? And did the existence of a large collaborationist army significantly prolong Japan's ability to occupy China? On number 11, could an alliance be based on a misunderstanding? The story of the alliance between Thailand and Japan is a unique case in the war. Unlike many other collaborations, it was not born out of shared ideology or a long-standing partnership. It was a shotgun wedding, a pragmatic choice made by a small country under immense pressure. Thailand, then known as Siam, had managed to remain independent throughout the colonial era, a rare feat in Southeast Asia. It did so through clever diplomacy, playing the British and French empires off against each other. When the war began, its government, led by Prime Minister Plek Phiban-Songkhram, often known as Phiban, tried to do the same thing. They declared neutrality, but that neutrality was shattered on December 8, 1941. Hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces invaded Thailand. They needed to move troops through the country to attack British Malaya and Burma. The Thai army resisted for a few hours, but it was a hopeless fight. Phibun was faced with a stark choice: become a conquered and occupied territory, or collaborate with the invaders and try to maintain some semblance of sovereignty. He chose collaboration. A ceasefire was quickly called. An agreement was signed that allowed Japanese troops free passage through Thailand. A few weeks later, on December 21st, Thailand signed a formal military alliance with Japan. In January 1942, Thailand declared war on the United States and Great Britain. For the rest of the war, Thailand was an official member of the Axis, but it was a very reluctant ally. The alliance brought some benefits. Japan helped Thailand regain some territories it had previously lost to the French in Laos and Cambodia, but it also came at a huge cost. The Thai economy was effectively taken over to serve the Japanese war effort. The construction of the infamous Death Railway from Thailand to Burma used Allied prisoners of war and thousands of Asian laborers, many of whom died under horrific conditions. This project, which served the Japanese military, was built on Thai soil with the government's reluctant approval. What makes the Thai case so interesting is what was happening behind the scenes. While the official government of Phibun was allied with Japan, a powerful and well-organized anti-Japanese resistance movement was growing. It was called the Free Thai Movement, and its leader was Pretty Bonomyong, the regent for the young king. This meant that the head of state was secretly leading the resistance against the country's official allies. The Free Thai Movement had connections to the Allies, particularly the American Office of Strategic Services OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. They provided intelligence, conducted sabotage, and prepared for an eventual uprising against the Japanese. The US government, recognizing this strange situation, never really accepted Thailand's declaration of war. They secretly funded and supported the Free Thai Movement. The American minister to Thailand, who was in the country when the invasion happened, was allowed to remain under house arrest, and from there he helped coordinate with the resistance. So Thailand was in a bizarre dual state. Its official government was an ally of Japan, while a parallel secret structure was working with the Allies to liberate the country. After Japan's surrender, this duality saved Thailand. The Free Thai Movement emerged and declared that the declaration of war had been made under duress and was therefore null and void. The United States accepted this argument. Thailand was not treated as a defeated enemy. The collaborationist Prime Minister Phibun was put on trial but was acquitted. The country was able to navigate the post-war world with its sovereignty intact. The Thai story is a masterclass in pragmatic diplomacy and national survival. It was a case of collaborating on the surface while resisting in the shadows, a high-wire act that somehow succeeded. How much did Prime Minister Phibun know about the activities of the Free Thai Movement? Was he secretly playing a double game, or was he genuinely out of the loop? What was the level of communication between the Free Thai Movement and resistance groups in neighboring Malaya and Burma? And if the Japanese had discovered the full extent of the region's involvement in the resistance, what would have been the consequences for the Thai royal family? Number 10, did the Cossacks choose the wrong side? The Cossacks have a long and storied history in Russia. They were a semi-nomadic militaristic people living on the steppes of southern Russia and Ukraine. For centuries, they had served the Russian Tsars as elite cavalry, fiercely loyal to the crown and the Orthodox Church. But after the Russian Revolution, their world was turned upside down. The new Soviet government saw them as a symbol of the old regime and subjected them to years of brutal repression. Their lands were taken, their culture was suppressed, and many were executed or deported. This history of persecution created a deep well of anti-Soviet sentiment among the Cossacks. So, when the German army invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and swept across the Cossack homelands of the Don and Kuban river basins, some saw them not as invaders, but as liberators. They saw an opportunity to get revenge on the government that had destroyed their way of life and to perhaps restore their old independence. This led to a significant collaboration between some Cossack communities and the German military. As the German army advanced, Cossack leaders approached them, offering their services. The German command, initially skeptical, soon realized the value of these experienced horsemen. They knew the terrain and were motivated fighters. Several Cossack military formations were established to fight alongside the German army. The largest of these was the 1st Cossack Cavalry Division. It was formed in 1943 and was commanded by a German general, Helmuth von Ponnwitz, who was an admirer of Cossack culture. The division was made up of Don, Kuban, and Terek Cossacks, many of whom were veterans of the Russian Civil War who had been living in exile. They were equipped by the Germans, but retained many of their own traditions, uniforms, and commanders. These Cossack units were primarily used for anti-partisan warfare. They fought against Soviet resistance fighters in the rear areas of the Eastern Front in places like Belarus and Ukraine. They were known for their brutality and effectiveness in these operations. Later in the war, as the German army retreated, the Cossack division was transferred to the Balkans, where they fought against Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia. For the Cossacks who collaborated, this was not about supporting the German ideology. It was a desperate gamble. And they were fighting for their own survival and for the dream of an independent Cossack nation, a Kosakia, which the German government had vaguely promised them. They brought their families with them, creating large mobile camps that followed the army. The end of the war was a tragedy for them. The Cossack division, along with thousands of civilian family members, retreated into Austria and surrendered to the British army. They believed the Western Allies would give them political asylum and support their anti-Soviet cause. But at the Yalta Conference, the Allied leaders had made an agreement to repatriate all Soviet citizens to the Soviet Union, regardless of their wishes. In what became known as the repatriation of the Cossacks, or the betrayal of the Cossacks, the British forcibly handed over tens of thousands of Cossack soldiers and civilians to the Soviet authorities. Many were executed immediately, others were sent to the Gulag, where most perished. It was a brutal end to their desperate alliance. Their collaboration, born out of historical grievances, had led them to utter destruction. What was the exact nature of the promises made by German officials to the Cossack leaders regarding an independent state? How many Cossacks were forcibly repatriated after the war, and what percentage of them survived the Soviet camps? And were there any British officers on the ground who protested the repatriation order, and if so, what happened to them? Number 9. Could an alliance be a matter of paperwork? The Haavara Agreement was not a military or political alliance in the traditional sense. It was a complex and controversial economic agreement signed in 1933 between two unlikely partners, Zionist organizations in Palestine and the German government. The purpose of the deal was to facilitate the emigration of German Jews to Palestine, but the way it worked was startling. Here is the basic mechanism. A German Jew who wanted to emigrate to Palestine had to deposit their money into a special account in Germany. That money was then used by a trust company set up as part of the agreement to purchase German-made goods like farming equipment, construction materials, or raw materials. These goods were then exported to Palestine and sold by a Jewish-owned import company in Tel Aviv. When the goods were sold, the proceeds in Palestinian pounds were given to the Jewish emigrant who had originally deposited their money in Germany. The agreement had benefits for both sides, which is what made it so controversial. For German Jews, it was a way to get out of Germany and to salvage at least some of their assets. Under normal circumstances, the German government imposed a heavy flight tax that would confiscate most of the wealth of anyone trying to leave. The Haavara Agreement provided a loophole. Over 60,000 German Jews were able to emigrate to Palestine through this program between 1933 and 1939, bringing with them over 100 million Reichsmarks worth of capital, which was crucial for the development of the Jewish community there. For the German government, the agreement had two major advantages. First, it aligned with their policy of encouraging Jewish immigration. Second, it was a way to bypass the growing international boycott of German goods. Many Jewish organizations around the world were calling for a boycott to protest the regime's policies. The Haavara Agreement effectively broke that boycott. It turned a portion of the Jewish community in Palestine into distributors of German products. It was a way for Germany to boost its exports and get much needed foreign currency, all while pursuing its domestic agenda. The agreement was fiercely debated within the Zionist movement and the wider Jewish world. Critics were horrified. They argued that it was a betrayal, a collaboration with a persecuting regime. They believed that the moral priority should be the economic and political isolation of the German government through a boycott. They saw the agreement as a form of appeasement that gave the regime legitimacy and economic support. Supporters of the agreement, like the leaders of the Jewish Agency in Palestine, took a pragmatic view. They argued that their primary responsibility was to save lives and build a Jewish homeland. The agreement, however distasteful, was a practical tool to achieve both of those goals. They saw it as Rettungspolitik, or the politics of rescue. The historian Edwin Black documented this painful dilemma in his book, The Transfer Agreement. The Havara Agreement operated until the start of the war in 1939 made it impossible to continue. It remains a stark example of the agonizing choices that can arise in desperate times. It was a deal that saved both lives and assets, but it did so by creating an economic partnership with a regime that was actively persecuting the very people the deal was meant to save. It was an alliance of pure, desperate pragmatism. To what extent did the British Mandate authorities in Palestine facilitate or obstruct the Havara Agreement? What was the reaction of Arab leaders in Palestine to the influx of German goods and capital into the Jewish sector of the economy? And are there any records of private conversations between the Zionist and German negotiators that reveal the moral and ethical debates they had while hammering out the deal? Number 8, who really controlled Vichy France? When France fell to the German army in the summer of 1940, the country was split in two. The north was directly occupied by German forces. The south became a supposedly independent state, with its capital in the spa town of Vichy. This Vichy France was led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of the First World War. For 4 years, the Vichy regime walked a tightrope of collaboration, claiming it was protecting the French people while becoming increasingly entangled with the German government. The collaboration was based on the Armistice of June 22, 1940. This agreement officially ended the fighting, but it put France in a position of subservience. France had to pay the massive costs of the German occupation. Its remaining army was severely limited. Its navy was to be disarmed, and it was required to cooperate with the German authorities. Initially, Pétain and his prime minister, Pierre Laval, pursued a policy of state collaboration. They believed that by proactively cooperating with the German government, they could secure a better place for France in the new European order they thought was emerging. They saw the defeat not just as a military loss, but as a moral failure of the French Republic. They wanted to replace the old ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity with a new, more authoritarian vision of work, family, fatherland. The collaboration was extensive. Economically, France became a major asset for the German war effort, and French factories produced vehicles, aircraft parts, and other materials for the German military. French agriculture was used to feed Germany. A significant portion of France's industrial and agricultural output was diverted. This is detailed in Robert Paxton's seminal work, Vichy France, Old Guard and New Order, which showed that the collaboration was often driven by the French themselves, not just imposed by the Germans. The collaboration was also military and political. The Vichy government controlled the powerful French navy and the vast French colonial empire. They actively resisted Allied attempts to take over parts of the empire, for example, fighting against British and Free French forces in Syria and Lebanon in 1941. One of the darkest aspects of the collaboration was the creation of the Milice, a French political police force formed in 1943. The Milice worked closely with the German authorities. They fought against the French resistance, which they viewed as terrorists and communists. They were known for their extreme brutality and were deeply hated by much of the population. The Milice represented the endpoint of collaboration, where Frenchmen were actively fighting other Frenchmen on behalf of the occupying power. In November 1942, the illusion of an independent Vichy France was shattered. In response to the Allied landings in North Africa, German forces occupied the southern zone as well. From that point on, the Vichy government was a puppet in all but name, but it continued to exist, providing an administrative and policing structure that served the occupiers until the liberation of France in 1944. The legacy of Vichy is a deep wound in the French national memory. It is a story of a country that in a moment of defeat chose a path of compromise that led to complicity. Was it a necessary evil to protect the population from something worse, as Pétain claimed, or was it a betrayal of everything the nation stood for? The debate continues in France to this day. What was the full extent of the financial collaboration between French banks and the German government? How much secret communication existed between officials in the Vichy government and Charles de Gaulle's Free French movement in London? And if the French Navy had sailed to join the Allies in 1940 instead of remaining under Vichy control, how would that have changed the course of the war in the Mediterranean? Number 7. How did a neutral Portugal play both sides? Portugal, under the authoritarian rule of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, was officially neutral throughout the war. But, like Sweden and Switzerland, this was a very active and profitable neutrality. Like Salazar was a master of the double game. He managed to maintain friendly relations with both the Axis and the Allied powers, selling critical resources to both sides and extracting concessions from each. Portugal's most important asset was tungsten. Tungsten, also known as wolfram, is a metal that is essential for producing high-quality hardened steel. It was used for things like machine tools, armor plate, and, most critically, the cores of armor-piercing shells. The German war industry had an insatiable appetite for tungsten, and Portugal was one of the few places in Europe where they could get it. Throughout the war, Portugal was a major supplier of tungsten to Germany. German agents and companies were all over Portugal, buying up as much of the metal as they could. At the same time, Portugal had a centuries-old alliance with Britain, the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, which dated back to 1373. Salazar never formally broke this alliance. He used it as leverage. The Allies were desperate to stop the flow of tungsten to Germany, so they started a preclusive buying campaign. British and American agents in Portugal began buying up tungsten at inflated prices, not because they needed it, but simply to keep it out of German hands. This created a massive bidding war, and the price of tungsten skyrocketed. The Portuguese state, which controlled the industry, made a fortune. Salazar's most important concession to the Allies came in 1943. He granted them the use of a crucial air and naval base in the Azores, a group of Portuguese islands in the middle of the Atlantic. This base was a game-changer in the Battle of the Atlantic. It allowed Allied long-range patrol aircraft to cover the mid-Atlantic gap, an area where German submarines had previously been able to operate with impunity, safe from air cover. The Azores base was instrumental in defeating the U-boat threat. Salazar's decision to grant this base was a major pivot towards the Allies, made at a time when the tide of the war was clearly turning. But even after giving the Allies the base, he continued to sell tungsten to Germany. He squeezed every last drop of advantage from his position. He only fully embargoed tungsten sales to Germany in mid-1944, under immense pressure from the Allies, and when the German defeat was all but certain. Lisbon, the Portuguese capital, became the great spy hub of the war. Because Portugal was neutral, both sides could operate there openly. It was a city of spies, refugees, diplomats, and shady businessmen. The hotels and cafes were full of intrigue. It was a place where the lines between enemies were blurred, a Casablanca in real life. Salazar's policy was one of cold, calculated self-interest. He had no ideological love for either side. His only goal was to protect Portugal, maintain his own power, and profit from the conflict. He successfully kept his country out of the fighting and enriched its treasury in the process. It was a masterful, if deeply cynical, performance on the world stage. What secret escape lines for Allied airmen and refugees ran through Portugal, and how much did Salazar's government know about them? Were there any secret protocols attached to the Azores base agreement that promised post-war economic aid or political support for Salazar's regime? And how close did Portugal come to being invaded by either side to secure its resources or strategic location? Number 6, what was the price of Irish neutrality? Ireland's neutrality during the war, a policy known as the emergency, was deeply rooted in its history. Having only recently gained independence from Britain after a long and bitter struggle, the Irish government, led by Taoiseach Prime Minister Eamon de Valera, was determined to stay out of a conflict that was widely seen as Brighton's War. This policy had overwhelming popular support, but it was a neutrality that caused immense friction with the Allies and involved a level of quiet, unstated cooperation with them. The biggest point of contention was the treaty ports. As part of the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, Britain had retained the right to use 3 deep-water ports on the Irish coast. In 1938, in a gesture of goodwill, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned the ports to Ireland. When the war began, this decision was bitterly regretted in London. The ports would have been invaluable for the Royal Navy in the Battle of the Atlantic. Without them, British ships had to operate from bases further east, extending their patrol routes and leaving them more vulnerable. Winston Churchill, in particular, never forgave de Valera for refusing to lease the ports back to Britain. Despite this public friction, there was a surprising amount of secret cooperation between the Irish and British authorities. Irish intelligence services shared information with their British counterparts, MI5 and MI6. They passed on intelligence about German espionage activity in Ireland. The German legation in Dublin was a known hub of spies, and the Irish government kept a close watch on them. Several German agents who parachuted into Ireland were quickly rounded up and interned. There was also practical military cooperation. The Irish and British militaries had secret talks about how to respond to a potential German invasion of Ireland, which was a real fear for both sides. A German-controlled Ireland would have been a dagger pointed at the heart of Britain. There was an informal agreement that if Germany invaded, the Irish army would fight, and British troops would immediately cross the border from Northern Ireland to support them. Furthermore, there was a benevolent neutrality towards Allied airmen. Allied pilots who crashed or made emergency landings in Ireland were quietly repatriated across the border to British-controlled Northern Ireland. The German airmen, by contrast, were interned for the duration of the war in accordance with strict neutrality rules. There was also a secret corridor over a sliver of Irish territory that Allied planes used to fly from Northern Ireland out into the Atlantic, shortening their journey. But de Valera's government was also rigid in its public neutrality. When the war in Europe ended, he famously and controversially offered his official condolences to the German ambassador in Dublin upon the death of the German chancellor. This act, seen as a shocking insult by the Allies, was, in de Valera's mind, the logical act of a strictly neutral state that had maintained diplomatic relations with Germany throughout the war. Irish neutrality was a complex balancing act. It was a fierce assertion of national sovereignty, but it was also a pragmatic policy that recognized the geopolitical reality that an Axis victory or a German-occupied Britain would be a disaster for Ireland. So, while publicly maintaining a strict and sometimes frustrating neutrality, they secretly cooperated with the Allies in ways that were crucial for mutual survival. What was the full extent of the intelligence sharing between Dublin and London? Were there any joint counter-espionage operations that have never been declassified? How many Allied airmen were secretly helped to escape from Ireland? And if Germany had attempted an invasion, how effective would the planned joint Irish-British defense have been? Number 5. Why did two enemies join forces in China? The Second Sino-Japanese War, which merged into the broader Second World War, is often seen as the moment when China's long-running civil war was put on hold. The two main rivals, the ruling Nationalist Party KMT led by Chiang Kai-shek and the Communist Party of China CPC led by Mao Zedong, agreed to form a united front to fight their common enemy, the invading Japanese army. This alliance, known as the Second United Front, was formed in 1937. It was a shotgun marriage born of necessity, but it was a deeply dysfunctional and distrustful collaboration from the very beginning. The background was years of bitter civil war. The KMT had spent a decade trying to eradicate the CPC, forcing them on the epic Long March, but the growing aggression of Japan, which had seized Manchuria in 1931 and was encroaching further into China, changed the political calculus. Public opinion in China was demanding that the civil war stop and that all Chinese forces unite to resist the invaders. The pressure culminated in the Xi'an incident in 1936, when one of Chiang Kai-shek's own generals kidnapped him and forced him to negotiate a truce with the communists. The Second United Front was the result. On the surface, they were allies. The communist armies were nominally integrated into the National Revolutionary Army. They received some funding and equipment from the central government. Both sides pledged to stop fighting each other and to focus on the Japanese. In the early stages of the war, there was some genuine cooperation, but the deep-seated suspicion never went away. The alliance was, as one historian put it, a union of the unwilling. Both Chiang and Mao saw the war against Japan as an opportunity to strengthen their own positions for the inevitable final showdown between them. Chiang Kai-shek's strategy was to preserve his best troops for the future fight against the communists. He often used provincial or warlord armies as cannon fodder against the Japanese while holding his elite German-trained divisions in reserve. The communists, for their part, avoided major conventional battles with the Japanese. Their strategy, perfected by Mao, was to use guerrilla warfare. They would move into the countryside behind Japanese lines, build up their political base among the peasants, and conduct small-scale attacks and sabotage. Their goal was to expand their territory and their influence under the cover of the anti-Japanese resistance. This led to a strange and tragic dynamic. The KMT and the CPC were supposed to be allies, but they were also constantly jockeying for position. There were frequent armed clashes between KMT and communist forces, even as the war with Japan raged on. The most infamous of these was the New Fourth Army incident in 1941, where KMT forces ambushed and destroyed a large communist army unit. This event shattered any remaining trust and effectively ended any real cooperation. For the rest of the war, the United Front was mostly a fiction. China was divided into three main zones: Japanese-occupied China, nationalist-controlled China, and communist-controlled liberated areas. The KMT and the CPC spent as much energy blockading and spying on each other as they did fighting the Japanese. The United States, which entered the war and became a major supporter of the Chinese government, was constantly frustrated by this internal division. American diplomats and generals tried to patch up the alliance, but the rift was too deep. The collaboration was a failure. It was an alliance in name only, a temporary truce in a longer civil war. As soon as Japan surrendered in 1945, the truce ended. The final, decisive phase of the Chinese Civil War began almost immediately, leading to a communist victory in 1949. What was the true level of secret negotiation between the communists and the Japanese, aimed at preserving their forces by avoiding conflict? How much American aid intended for the nationalist government was diverted by corrupt officials or used to blockade the communists? And if the KMT and CPC had truly and fully cooperated, could they have defeated the Japanese army in China on their own? Number 4, who were the Ustase? When Germany and Italy invaded and dismembered Yugoslavia in April 1941, they created a new puppet state, the independent state of Croatia, known by its Croatian acronym NDH. This state was handed over to a radical nationalist group called the Ustase, led by Ante Pavelic. The Ustase had been a small, extremist movement in exile before the war, supported by Mussolini's Italy. The invasion gave them the chance to seize power and implement their radical vision for Croatia. The NDH was not just a puppet state, it was an enthusiastic ally of the Axis powers. It formally joined the Tripartite Pact. It adopted political and social policies modeled on those of Germany and Italy. Pavelic, who took the title Poglavnik leader, established a brutal one-party totalitarian state. The collaboration was deeply military. The NDH formed its own army, the Croatian Home Guard Domobrani, and also an elite Ustase militia. Croatian units were sent to fight alongside the German army on the Eastern Front. A special unit, the Croatian Legion, was integrated directly into the German Wehrmacht and fought in the Battle of Stalingrad. Croatian pilots formed an Air Force Legion that flew with the German Luftwaffe, but the Ustases regime is most remembered for its own brutal internal war. The NDH was a multi-ethnic state with large populations of Serbs, Jews, and Roma Gypsies. The Ustase ideology was based on an extreme form of Croatian racial and religious nationalism. They viewed the Orthodox Christian Serbs, in particular, as aliens and enemies of the Croatian nation. They embarked on a terrifying campaign of persecution and extermination against these minorities. This campaign was carried out with extreme ferocity by the Ustase militia. They established a network of concentration camps, the most notorious of which was Jasenovac. Unlike the German-run camps elsewhere in Europe, Jasenovac was operated entirely by the Ustase themselves. The methods used there were exceptionally cruel. The historian Rory Yeomans, in works on the NDH, has detailed the fanaticism and violence of the regime. This internal violence created a massive backlash. Two major resistance movements emerged in Yugoslavia. The first were the Chetniks, a Serbian royalist and nationalist group. The second, and ultimately more successful, were the Partisans, a multi-ethnic communist-led movement led by Josip Broz Tito. This meant that the war in Yugoslavia was not just a war against the occupiers. It was a brutal, multi-sided civil war. The Ustase fought the Partisans and the Chetniks. The partisans and the Chetniks fought each other, and all of them fought the Germans and Italians. It was one of the most complex and savage theaters of the entire war. The Ustase regime was dependent on its patrons in Berlin and Rome. The state was jointly occupied by German and Italian troops who often distrusted each other and the Ustasi. The Italians, in their zone of occupation, were sometimes appalled by the Ustase's brutality and occasionally intervened to protect Serbs. The regime collapsed in 1945 as German forces were driven out of Yugoslavia by the partisans and the advancing Soviet army. Pavelic and other Ustase leaders fled, many escaping to South America through the same rat lines that helped German officials. The legacy of the NDH and the Ustase is a source of profound trauma and controversy in the Balkans to this day. It is a story of how a small group of extremists, empowered by a larger conflict, can unleash unimaginable horror. What was the full extent of the Vatican's knowledge of the Ustase's atrocities, and what was its relationship with the fiercely Catholic regime? How much control did the German and Italian military commands have over the actions of the Ustase militia, and did they ever try to restrain them? And how many Ustase officials successfully escaped after the war, and where did they go? Number 3. What happened to the Anders Army? The story of the Anders Army is one of the most incredible and tragic odysseys of the Second World War. It was a Polish army that was formed in the heart of the Soviet Union, fought in the Middle East and Italy, and then was ultimately betrayed by the very allies it fought for. It was an alliance of necessity between two deeply suspicious partners, the Polish government in exile in London and Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. The story begins in 1939, when Germany and the Soviet Union invaded and partitioned Poland. The Soviets captured hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers and deported over 1 million Polish civilians to labor camps and settlements deep inside the Soviet Union, primarily in Siberia and Kazakhstan. The conditions were horrific and many perished. Then, in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. This act instantly turned two enemies, the Soviet Union and the Polish government in exile, into reluctant allies. An agreement, the Sikorsky-Maysky Agreement, was signed in London. It nullified the partition of Poland and, crucially, allowed for the formation of a Polish army on Soviet soil. This army was to be made up of the Polish prisoners of war and civilians who had been deported. The man chosen to lead this new army was General Ladislaw Anders, who had himself been a prisoner in the Lubyanka prison in Moscow. He was released and given the monumental task of finding and assembling his soldiers and their families from the vast network of Soviet camps. Tens of thousands of emaciated, sick, and starving, Poles began a long journey to the army's assembly points. They were not just soldiers, they were civilians, women, and children, all desperate to escape the Gulag. But the collaboration was plagued by distrust. The Soviets were reluctant to arm and supply the new Polish army. They saw it as a potential threat. The Poles were desperate to find out what had happened to thousands of their officers who had been captured in 1939 but were now missing. The Soviets were evasive. The truth, which would only emerge later, was that the Soviet secret police had systematically executed over 20,000 of them in what became known as the Katyn massacre. As relations soured, an agreement was reached to evacuate the Anders Army from the Soviet Union. In 1942, in a massive logistical operation, over 115,000 people, soldiers, and civilians were transported by ship across the Caspian Sea to Iran, which was then under British and Soviet control. This was their exodus from the inhuman land, as it was called. Once in the Middle East, the army came under British command. They were equipped, retrained, and became the Polish II Corps. They fought with great distinction as part of the British Eighth Army. Their most famous battle was the Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy in 1944. After a series of failed and bloody assaults by other Allied troops, it was the Polish II Corps that finally captured the heavily fortified monastery, a pivotal moment in the Italian campaign. A Polish flag was raised over the ruins, but their victory was bittersweet. As they were fighting and dying in Italy, the political fate of their homeland was being decided, without their input, at the conferences in Tehran and Yalta. The Allied leaders Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed that Poland would fall under the Soviet sphere of influence after the war. The country the Anders Army had been fighting to liberate was to be handed over to the very power that had invaded it in 1939 and deported its people. After the war, the soldiers of the Anders Army were stranded. They could not go home to a communist-controlled Poland where they would be treated as traitors. Most of them remained in exile, settling in Britain, the United States, and other parts of the world. General Anders himself lived out his life in London. The army that had been formed in the Soviet Union and had fought its way across half the world had won its battles but lost its country. What was the true motivation behind Stalin's decision to allow the army to leave the Soviet Union? Did he see them as a nuisance, or did he have a more complex strategic reason? How many Polish civilians died in the Soviet Union before they could reach the Anders Army? And what private conversations took place between Churchill and Anders about the political fate of Poland? Number 2, who was buying American oil? The story of Standard Oil and its complex international dealings before and during the war is a stark reminder that for some global corporations, business often came before national loyalty. The relationships between major American companies and German industry were deep and did not simply evaporate when the political climate changed. One of the most significant and controversial relationships was between Standard Oil of New Jersey, the precursor to Exxon, and the giant German chemical conglomerate IG Farben. IG Farben was a cornerstone of the German war economy. It produced synthetic rubber, synthetic fuel, explosives, and many other critical materials. Before the war, Standard Oil and IG Farben had a close partnership. They had agreements to share technology and divide up global markets for certain products. A key part of their collaboration involved the development of synthetic materials. For example, they had a joint company to develop tetraethyl lead, a crucial additive for aviation gasoline. But the most critical technology was for synthetic rubber, or Buna. Under their agreements, IG Farben developed the technology for Buna rubber, but the patents were shared in a way that gave the German company control over its use. This meant that when the war began and the United States was cut off from its natural rubber supplies in Asia, it had a major rubber crisis. The US government discovered, to its fury, that its own ability to produce synthetic rubber was being hampered by these pre-war cartel agreements between an American company and a German one. This was the subject of major congressional hearings led by then Senator Harry Truman. The collaboration went beyond technology sharing. There were accusations of direct supply. In his book, The Secret War Against the Jews, author John Loftus claims that through intermediaries in neutral Spain, Standard Oil continued to ship fuel to the German government well into the war. The most famous example is the story of the tanker ships. Standard Oil had a fleet of tankers. When the war began, many of these were registered under the flag of Panama for convenience. The accusation is that these tankers would deliver oil to the Canary Islands, a Spanish territory where it would then be picked up by German tankers and taken to Hamburg. These activities were investigated by the U.S. government. Standard Oil and its executives, like Chairman William Stamps Farish, were heavily criticized. The company was accused of putting its business interests with IG Farben ahead of the national interests of the United States. The company defended itself by arguing that these were all pre-war agreements that were difficult to untangle and that they had done nothing illegal. But the perception of collaboration was powerful. Whether it was direct supply during the war or the pre-war cartel agreements that hindered the American war effort, the story of Standard Oil and IG Farben shows the immense power of multinational corporations. It suggests a world where corporate alliances could be just as strong, if not stronger, than national ones. The lines were not drawn between countries, but between business partners. For a company like Standard Oil, IG Farben was not an enemy, it was a partner in a global enterprise. What was the full extent of the communication between Standard Oil executives in the US and their counterparts at IG Farben during the war, using neutral intermediaries? How much American-produced oil actually made its way to the German war machine through neutral ports like those in Spain? And did the pre-war cartel agreements on synthetic rubber production significantly delay the Allied war effort? And if so, by how much? Number 1. Could IBM have said no? The collaboration between the American technology company IBM and the German government is perhaps one of the most chilling of the entire era. It was not about weapons or raw materials. It was about information. IBM did not provide guns. It provided a tool that made the German state's massive projects of organization and social sorting possible. That tool was the Hollerith punch card machine. The punch card machine was the cutting edge of data processing technology at the time. It was essentially an early computer. By punching holes in specific columns on a card, vast amounts of information could be coded, sorted, and cross-referenced at a speed that was previously unimaginable. IBM, through its German subsidiary De Homag Deutsche Hollerith Maschinengesellschaft, had a monopoly on this technology. From the moment the new government came to power in 1933, it had a massive appetite for data. It wanted to conduct a detailed census of the entire population. It needed to know not just who lived where, but also their ancestry, their religion, and other personal details. This was a monumental task, and it was made possible by IBM's technology. De Homag and its punch card machines were hired to process the German census of 1933 and the later, more detailed census of 1939. The information from these censuses was invaluable to the authorities. It allowed them to identify and categorize the population with frightening efficiency. The punch card system could quickly sort through millions of records to find people based on specific criteria. This story is the central theme of Edwin Black's exhaustive book, IBM and the Holocaust, which argues that IBM's technology was the essential tool that made the state's massive logistical operations possible. The collaboration was deep and continuous. IBM in New York, under its powerful leader Thomas J. Watson, maintained control over its German subsidiary throughout this period. De Homag was not a rogue agent. It was a key part of IBM's global business. Watson himself received a medal from the German government in 1937 for his contributions to world trade. Even after the war in Europe began in 1939, IBM continued to service the machines in Germany through its subsidiary in neutral Switzerland. The custom-designed punch cards, essential for the machines to work, were still being printed with the De Homag and IBM logos. The punch card machines were used for everything. They were used to organize the German railways, allowing for the precise scheduling of thousands of trains. They were used in occupied territories like Poland to keep track of resources and people. They were used to manage the allocation of forced labor. And they were used in the concentration camps themselves to catalog prisoners using a coded system. Each camp had its own code number. The central question is one of responsibility. IBM has always maintained that it lost control of its German subsidiary during the war and had no knowledge of how its technology was being used. Edwin Black's research challenges this, presenting evidence that the New York headquarters was deeply involved and aware of what was happening. The story of IBM and De Homag is a profound and disturbing case study in corporate complicity. It shows how a seemingly neutral technology, a tool for counting and sorting, can be used by a state to achieve horrific ends. And it was not a collaboration of shared ideology, but a collaboration of business. IBM provided a service. They had a client, and they fulfilled the client's needs. The nature of those needs and the ultimate use of the data they helped to process has been a source of dark controversy ever since. Did Thomas J. Watson have direct knowledge of how the punch card machines were being used to identify and persecute minority groups? What specific records from IBM's Geneva office, which managed European operations during the war, have never been made public? And could the German state's massive projects of social engineering and logistics have been carried out on the same scale and with the same efficiency without IBM's unique technology?